Фамилия, имя, отчество?
Кулачко Виталий Олегович.
Подразделение какое у тебя?
92-я бригада.
Сколько еще здесь ваших тут болтается?
Та нас
Кто
тут,
еще живой?
нас тут всього 5 чоловік було.
Ага.
От усіх положили, я останній.
As diplomatic talks in Istanbul remain in their preliminary stages, the intensity of military operations on the front lines shows no signs of abating. Both Russian and Ukrainian forces have escalated aerial and ground engagements, underscoring the fragile nature of the current ceasefire negotiations. On the front lines, Ukrainian forces renewed attempts to breach Russian defenses in the Kursk region, deploying infantry, mobile units, and even boats to cross the Sem River. Russian troops repelled multiple incursions, destroying armored vehicles and thwarting sabotage groups disguised in Russian uniforms. However, Ukrainian rocket attacks inflicted damage on civilian infrastructure, including a hospital and a church in Tyotkino, further escalating tensions, according to South Front Press. The Russian offensive continued on Donbas front lines, with the liberation of Volnoye Pole in the south and sustained pressure on key strongholds like Kostyantynivka in the north. Russian victory in Kursk near Krasny Liman further weakened Ukrainian positions, with reports indicating manpower shortages in defending Ukrainian units. Russian forces meanwhile consolidated gains near Pokrovsk, threatening to envelop Ukrainian defenses along the Kazeni-Torets River. Western analysts noted a cascading collapse of Ukrainian defenses in several directions, attributing Russian gains to relentless strikes and artillery barrages. The juxtaposition of ongoing negotiations and escalating combat operations underscores the precarious nature of the conflict. While diplomats are trying to engage in dialogue, the battlefield realities suggest neither side is willing to cede ground without a fight. The coming days will reveal whether the talks in Istanbul can yield tangible de-escalation, or if the war will continue to overshadow diplomatic efforts. Even Ukrainian media reported that despite a 22% decrease in the number of combat clashes, down to 1,100 over the past week, they admit that Russian forces managed to seize several strategically important fortified positions and create new threats. The Pokrovsk sector, they say, remains the hottest, but Novopavlivka direction has taken the second place for the second week in a row, from where the Russian forces wish to bypass Pokrovsk. Lastly, we have a report from a commander of the 1st Battalion of the 47th Mechanized Brigade, Alexander Shershin, about his desire to resign from his position in protest against the incompetent decisions of the Ukrainian command in Kursk, which is considered an important event in the army and society. The translation of this report into English leads to some confusion. However, at the end of the video, I will highlight some of the more important points from that report. So my friends, today we have a very long overdue frontline report. I must apologize for my absence for the past week as I was busy tending to my 4-month-old baby daughter. However, we have a lot to cover, and we will be focusing on the Pokrovsk and Novopavlivka fronts, as well as further up north near Kupiansk. Then we will delve into a brief report we have from a Ukrainian commander about the incompetence within the army command that led to a loss of many soldiers in the Kursk region. As usual, I appreciate any super thanks donations and consider joining the channel membership. A video explaining the perks will be in the end screen, and it is perhaps the best way to support my work in this increasingly censored platform of YouTube. And without further ado, let's get into it. Over the past week, in the south of this area, the Russian force again advanced 1 kilometer along the Ugleda-Huliapol road. During the offensive, the Russian troops gained a foothold in the eastern part of Novosilka. Fighting is currently ongoing for this important village. Ukrainian soldiers to the west of Novopil are in a fire trap. If the Ukrainian armed forces do not conduct successful counterattacks, they will have to surrender these positions and retreat to the new Novopil-Zeleny Pole defense line. In the meantime, the Ukrainian defense forces held back the Russian troops and stabilized the entire multi-kilometer front line from Novosilka to Dnipro in area and Rozdolny. But the village of Bogatyr, which is one of Ukraine's most important fortifications on the Novopavlivka front, underwent some fierce battles this past week. Ukrainian media reports that Russian motorized infantry were constantly pushing into the central streets and occupied the southeastern part of the village. They admit, however, that the offensive was so powerful that Ukraine expected bad news from there every day. The Ukrainian Defense Forces reported that they counterattacked repeatedly and had captured a part of Bogatyr. In quotations, "Our next fortified area is Oradny," they said, but the approach of the front line to it will have an extremely negative impact on the Dnipro area defense. This was the last Ukrainian report on this area. However, Russian media reported on May 18th that, and I quote, "The capture of the village of Bogatyr in the DPR by the Russian army has weakened the defense of the Ukrainian armed forces in the South Donetsk direction," the defense ministry said, thereby confirming the fall of Bogatyr. In quotations, "The liberation of the village of Bogatyr dealt a serious blow to the enemy's defense in the Yuzhno-Donetsk direction. The militants turned the village into a powerful fortified area and a logistics hub several kilometers from the border with the Dnipro region," the press release said. And as if they knew it was coming, Ukrainian media was already speculating this past week that the capture of Bogatyr would put the defenders of Constantinople in an extremely difficult position. In quotations, "Their logistics have already been cut off, and they will be surrounded, as retreating across the Vovcha River is not only dangerous, but also makes it impossible to take the heavy equipment with them. Therefore, most likely, in the coming days, the Ukrainian military will leave Constantinople and then Andriivka and focus on the Bogatyr and Oleksivka defense." Russian forces are advancing along both banks of the river and have already created a significant gray zone north and west of Andriivka, through which they will break through to Oleksivka. In the north of the Novopavlivka front, the Russians pushing to the Dnipro region did not secure full control of Kostyantynivka, according to Ukrainian sources, and was stopped by the Ukrainian Defense Forces 2.5 kilometers from the administrative border of the Donetsk region. They then turned their efforts to expanding the battle zone between Nadivka and Novo-Alexandrivka, where the Russian troops controlled several more streets, pushing the Ukrainian armed forces to the western outskirts of this village. Now on the Pokrovsk-Toretsk-Konstantinivka front, there is a serious threat of a frontline breach. Over the past week, the Russian forces broke through the Ukrainian defense and made significant inroads on the front line between Pokrovsk and Kostyantynivka. The most painful for Ukraine is the Russian advance to Myro-Lyubivka and the partial control of Malinivka. This threatens to encircle the Ukrainian defenders in Yelizavetovka, who have been holding back the Russians in these positions for more than 6 months. In addition, further advancement to the northwest will allow the Russians not only to threaten the outskirts of Myrnograd, but also to try to cut off the logistics to Pokrovsk from the north. At the same time, the positions in Yelizavetovka currently allow the Ukrainian armed forces to conduct counterattacks, which we saw in this area last year. Moving toward Konstantinivka along the road, the Russian troops continue to expand their control zone in the direction of Nova Poltavka and complete the occupation of Novo Olenivka and Alexandropol. Also, advanced assault units have already attempted to attack the outskirts of Yablunivka, 6 kilometers from the front line. Battles for Nova Poltavka and Myro-Lyubivka over the past week were crucial for the Russian forces' further advance over a fairly wide section of the front, which they were able to ensure by accumulating a huge number of drones that significantly slowed down Ukrainian logistics. As of the 18th of May, Top War RU, a Russian media outlet, reported that Russian armed forces liberated the village of Novaya Poltavka. And today it became known that they approached Poltavka. Thus, in this section of the front, Russian army units covered about 5 kilometers in 24 hours, bringing an area of about 15 square kilometers under their control. Currently, fighting is taking place along the Poltavka-Popov-Yar line. These villages are located close to each other, to the east of the road to Juzivka and Kramatorsk. It is about 7 kilometers from Poltavka to this road, and if the pace of the Russian armed forces advance on this section of the front lines, then the Ukrainians may lose the opportunity to use the shortest route between Pokrovsk and the aforementioned Juzivka through Shakovo and Sofiapivka as early as next week. And the only communication route left for the Ukrainian armed forces between the aforementioned cities will be through Dobropole. This can cause significant damage to the logistics of the Ukrainian armed forces in Kostyantynivka, which is being systematically approached by units of the Russian armed forces. And the exit to Poltavka is also a continuation of the encirclement of the Ukrainian armed forces in Pokrovsk, where General Drapati's units have been trying to set up positions within the city limits in the last few weeks. Ukrainian defense forces, however, were able to slow down the Russian advance along the Donetsk-Konstantinivka highway. There, they were able to advance only 1 kilometer near Romanivka. Currently, the Russian troops are focusing their attacks on leveling the front line and closing the pocket that has formed between Alexandroville and Romanivka. This would allow them to concentrate their forces for new breakthroughs towards Konstantinivka. The Russian army is unlikely to be able to capture another pocket between Leonidivka and Toretsk, but because the Russians have seized several more streets in the southern district of Toretsk called Zabalka, it will be extremely difficult for the Ukrainian military to hold the line there. Therefore, it is likely that in the near future, the Russians will be able to occupy another significant grey area near Nelipivka. It is now a test of time to see how long Chasiv Yar's defense will hold out. Recently, Russian soldiers have advanced and gained a foothold in several more streets of Chasiv Yar, which has been holding them back from breaking through to Konstantinivka for more than a year. However, the Ukrainian defense forces have fewer and fewer opportunities to continue to hold the front here, especially in the face of disrupted logistics. The front line will have a steady tendency to steadily approach the outskirts of Konstantinivka, which has long ceased to be a rare city and has become a target not only for missiles and bombs, but also for drones. On the Liman front, over this past week, Russian forces captured the village of Novi and almost occupied the neighboring Lipove. There, the Ukrainian armed forces held important heights, after the fall of which the Russians would have better opportunities to advance both south to Liman and north to Borova. To do this, they are advancing on Ridokab and Zelene Dolina, the last villages located on the hill. If the Russian forces establish control over them, they will be able to shell Ukrainian positions in the Nitrius River valley much better. This week, the Russian army expanded their zone of control by several kilometers to the west of Makivka, where they are trying to drive the Ukrainian defense forces out of the last villages in Luhansk region. And on the front line to the south, the Russian troops finally controlled Yampolivka and advanced even further to Torsk, where the first assault brigades have already begun to arrive. They even tried to set up their own tricolor flag to announce the occupation of Torsk in the media. Now this next section will contain the report from the Ukrainian commander Shushin. It was translated into English, but some of the sentences are hard to discern. So I pulled out just a few brief important points that I thought will interest my viewers from this report. What we are talking about, he said, is the village of Tyotkino in Kursk, which the Russians are covering with their drones. It is an attempt by Ukraine to attack columns of equipment head-on under the observation and fire of Russian drones that leads to significant losses of equipment and people. The tasks, he said, do not always correspond to the capabilities of the troops, the terrain and elementary tactics. The military command's underestimation of the threat of drones leads to failures in engineering, support, protection of equipment and people, as well as to gross errors in planning and use of troops. The political task of conducting combat operations on Russian territory, which is set by the headquarters, is poorly organized and planned at the operational and tactical levels, and no one is trying to draw conclusions and learn, but on the contrary, they continue to repeat the same mistakes many times, not counting the losses.
Да, забираем, уёбываем, Лёнь.